And we have the good fortune to have the Deputy Director of the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering. Is that right? I think. I might get it wrong. But here today to give us a view into what the NIBIB's pipeline is, who works a lot with these device groups, is for the future. And so I am extremely pleased to introduce and welcome Dr. Jill Heemskerk.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, you did get the name right, although we've taken to calling it the Engineering Institute because we all think there are too many B's and I's in that name. I'm really happy to be here today and to give this talk. This is all of the issues that you're wrestling with these with the current sensors and how to apply them in real life situations are incredibly complex and valuable, and they're only going to get more valuable with time, because what I'm going to tell you about is that in our view we're at a stage right now where biomedical research is only getting richer in technology and an engineering focus. And so over time, as you'll see in a couple of examples I can show you, we'll be adding to the sensor approaches in a way that is, and the computational approaches in a way that we believe this whole field is going to be exploding. So to just orient you a little bit, NIH, the National Institutes of Health, is made up of 27 different institutes and centers. Most of them are focused on particular organ systems or diseases. Linda Brady's from the Mental Health Institute, for example. You're probably familiar with the Cancer Institute. Tony Fauci's all over the news with coronavirus right now from the Allergy and Infectious Disease Institute. And it's a really big organization. So the budget is $40 billion annually. And important to note that $1.2 billion of that is set aside for small business grants. So it is one of the biggest providers of non-dilutive funding for small businesses. We support overall 300,000 researchers and in 2,700 different institutions, universities, research institutions, companies. And we get NIH-wide 55,000 grant applications every year. So it's a gigantic enterprise. And NIBIB is down there in the corner. We're one of the Johnny-come-lately institutes. We were established in 2000 and really got up to work in 2002. Our budget is 1% of the NIH budget, so we're around 400 million. But we punch well above our weight, as I will describe to you. In fact, because our institute is all about technology and not about diseases or particular organs, we play a central collaborative role with all the other institutes at NIH. And this is our new director, Bruce Tromberg, his view of what the NIH org chart should look like, with NIBIB right in the middle, interfacing with and supporting all of the other institutes, bringing technologies to help them solve the problems within their mission spaces. It's really been a remarkable time having a new director. I think none of us, we all are really into supporting engineering and biomedical imaging, but none of us had really stopped to think, where are we on the growth curve? And he came in and started asking questions about the size of the field and whether it's growing, and he found out some really remarkable things, one of which is here, looking at over time from 2008 until now, looking at the proportion of the NIH budget that goes to bioengineering research. And it started in the days when NIBIB started, there was very little, less than 1% of NIH funding was going to bioengineering. And while the NIH budget has grown only by 26% over this time period, the bioengineering has increased 78%. The amount of funding going to bioengineering has increased 78%. And we're now at 13% of the NIH budget. And that's a substantial amount. And in fact, Bruce will point out that in another 30 years at this growth rate, NIH will be about 90% bioengineering. But even at 13% compared to what it was 10 years ago, the flavor of the research across NIH has changed because of the input of the bioengineering perspective into biomedical and basic science research. NIBIB is small, as I said, but we do have very active collaborations with the other institutes at NIH. And this slide shows some of our important partnerships in large trans-NIH programs, such as the BRAIN Initiative, the HEAL Initiative for opioids and pain. And all of our scientific program staff are deeply embedded in these initiatives and executing these initiatives, because in any area where we start to try to solve a new problem by focusing resources on it, one of the first things that the advisory groups tell us is you need new technology to make new discoveries. And so as small as NIBIB is, it is critically important as a player in launching these initiatives. Through these partnerships, we bring in about $50 million a year to our research community. So the individual funding announcements that get developed by our staff within the context of these bigger initiatives sort of increases the resources that we spread into the community by about 20%. This is just an example to show you the importance of this. The NIH BRAIN Initiative, many of you will be aware, is a large initiative started about 5 years ago that has the very ambitious goal of understanding how the brain works, how we think, how we feel, how we remember. And it's a very large kind of a black box question. And there again, new technologies was the first suggestion that the advisors made, so that we can see into the brain both invasively and non-invasively across all scales. And we're only about 5 years in, but overall this is projected to be a $5.2 billion effort, assuming that the projected funding actually does come through from Congress. And looking at what those dollars are funding, it was kind of startling to see that 60% of those dollars are going to bioengineering research, new development of new technologies, new imaging modalities, new ways to stimulate the nervous system, new ways to read out activity of the nervous system. And it's not because it's not an isolated phenomenon within NIH that bioengineering is growing in importance. It's actually a reflection of what's happening in the community. When we started, there were 30 bioengineering departments in the country, in all the schools in the country. And that number has quadrupled now to almost 120 in the last 15 years. And these bioengineering departments and engineering schools are, of course, as they're being formed, hiring new faculty, bringing on new students, and we're now seeing 1,600 undergraduate bioengineers being trained every year. And all of them have, as part of their required coursework, a design project. So that's 1,600 things and technologies and approaches and computational models that are being generated by the burst and the growth of bioengineering in academia. There's another trend that seems to be picking up steam, and that is the integration of engineers into medical schools. This started at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign a few years ago, creating a medical school that had as part of its curriculum engineering and bringing engineers to think about medicine from their sort of design-directed perspective, their physical science, heavily math, heavily design-oriented perspective. And our former director, the founding director, Rod Pettigrew, left us last year to go and start a similar medical school at Texas A&M University, and there he coined the term physicianeers, that they are training physicianeers. And we hear a lot of talk about this at medical schools around the country, people beginning to appreciate the value that engineers can bring into the biomedical enterprise. So really the growth within NIH, as I said, is a growth that reflects what's happening in the community. And it's changing really the flavor of research in general at NIH, we believe. NIBIB is unique in many ways, not just that it's agnostic for disease and organ system, but this was a study done a few years ago by Mike Kalukowicz and Dick Eman, looking at patents generated per appropriated dollar at different governmental agencies and different institutes within NIH. And what you can see here is that NIBIB is really leading the pack for patent generation. And they used in this study patents as a proxy for return on investment of the dollars invested in research. Basically, the dollars that are generated from patents on average in spending within the pharmaceutical and biotech industries. And what they showed was that looking at NIH overall, for every dollar, every funding dollar invested in research, there's a $6 return on investment using patents as the proxy, which I thought wasn't too bad. But remarkably, NIBIB is over 5 times that, with every dollar invested yielding $33 in downstream R&D investment. And this is a reflection, again, of the unique kind of research that we support and the unique sort of goal-oriented nature of engineering. So one of the things that that we see happening, and this is very much the vision of our new director, who himself is an engineer, is that the current healthcare system is sort of impoverished for information, because everything, all the tests we do, the imaging, the blood tests, even getting genomic information is done every few years. Every year, every few years, you get a snapshot of where you are in that moment. And you know something about your condition, often you're driven to ask the question because of a health problem that you're having, at which point it's kind of, unfortunately, later than you'd like to be in the process. And so the vision is to transform healthcare in the future using the kinds of sensor technologies we've been talking about to continuously monitor the health condition of humans. And in doing that, be aware from moment to moment what the health state is and where something might be going wrong so that early intervention can happen. And the engineers think of it like a bridge. You build a bridge, put a bunch of sensors on it in key points so that if something is going to break, you know about it and you can go fix it before the bridge collapses. Similarly, if people were being monitored closely by sensors, you could have a similar kind of early indicator that something has to change, or you're going to get type 2 diabetes, or your blood pressure is high, or and not just the simple transition to a more preventive strategy in healthcare, but a new kind of an expectation that there'll be a new kind of information coming out from that kind of continuous monitoring. So we get a lot of data when we wear a heart rate monitor or a blood pressure monitor, and that data is kind of reduced to the same kind of information you would get if you were listening with a stethoscope or a blood pressure cuff. And there's all kinds of other stuff in there that is just right now ignored. It's the dynamics of how your heart rate changes in response to different activities that you do, and how your blood pressure changes in response to different situations. And none of that is really understood at this point, but there are many people who find that interesting and want to try to understand if there's a new kind of information in there that's actionable for healthcare. So NIBIB, under the new director, is kind of undergoing a bit of a not really a reorganization, but a sharpening of focus into areas that might best support the biomedical enterprise. I should point out that the National Institute of General Medical Sciences supports engineering as well. All of the NIH institutes do, which, if anyone wondered how we're 1%, but 13% of the NIH budget goes to engineering, it's because all the institutes fund some engineering. In the basic sciences, NIGMS funds engineering research. In the biomedical sciences, more health-oriented, that's within the mission space of NIBIB. And so we have different areas of focus now. Engineered biology is a way of taking an engineering approach to biology and thinking about cells and biological systems as sort of cyborgs that can be programmed with circuits and switches. There's a huge program in sensors and point of care technologies that are relevant to the discussions today, looking at all kinds of different types of sensors, and I've selected a few examples to show you today. There are countless examples of these approaches, though. In imaging technologies, we are not the supporters of the imaging studies. We're the supporters of the development of new imaging technologies. So we have the physicists and the mathematicians and the engineers trying to make imaging systems smaller, more usable, faster, cheaper, and to develop entirely new imaging modalities as well. And then we're very interested, of course, in therapeutic devices and ways that engineering might be brought to bear to develop treatments. One of the more interesting ones I've heard of recently is the focused ultrasound approach to brain surgery that allows treatment of, and this has been FDA cleared, allows treatment of essential tremor by doing very precise surgeries within the brain without opening up the skull. So these are the things engineers can do, surgery without scalpels. And if you think about imaging, nobody talks about exploratory surgery anymore. That used to be a thing, but we have MRI now and ultrasound and PET, so we don't have to open people up to find out what's wrong with them. In the center on this slide is the modeling, computation, machine intelligence focus, and that is an area that in this research community permeates everything they do. So math just underpins all of these different disciplines, not only to better analyze the data that comes out of an experimental setting, but to model the experimental setting and play with it digitally to try to improve the outcome of the work. So we have a tremendous focus in math and modeling. And of course, with the growing, the explosion really of artificial intelligence and machine learning, we have a lot of effort in that area. So I want to just give you a few examples of some of the kinds of sensors that our community is developing that down the road are going to bring some new kinds of approaches to the sorts of things that we've been talking about at this meeting. This is a early stage prototype. You have to imagine this is miniaturized and put into a watch, but this is a laser-based approach using Raman spectroscopy to measure glucose levels in the blood across the skin. And it's completely non-invasive, it's continuous, so imagine the convenience, if you have diabetes, of not having to prick yourself constantly, of knowing without having to prick yourself what your glucose level is. And it has the same level of accuracy as the current blood stick test. So we're very excited about this one. Another interesting continuous monitoring approach is for blood pressure. This is a little Band-Aid-like patch that sends ultrasound signals that are able to determine blood pressure from moment to moment, measuring the diameter of blood vessels as they change. Again, having this kind of continual monitoring, having the awareness and the early awareness of an increase in blood pressure and early awareness of whether prescribed medications are actually doing what they should be. And as I was saying, just having a new source of such complex information to be able to see if there's more to be known than what we know from simply measuring blood pressure episodically with a cuff. And then this one is just extraordinarily cool. This is these are aptamers that are synthetic nucleic acid sequences designed to very specifically recognize individual analytes and bind them very tightly. And they have a redox reporter tethered to a microelectrode. They have a redox reporter on one end that floats freely when it's unbound. And when the analyte is bound, it switches conformation, bringing the redox reporter into proximity with the microelectrode, which sends a signal that can be read externally and wirelessly. And this one, the proof of concept was developed with glucose and insulin so that you can have a constant kind of monitoring of insulin and glucose levels. There's proof of concept in the rat, but there's now been, this is a cool movie, it shows you the conformation change. This is from Peter So at Stanford, and he's now miniaturized this device down to the size where it's potentially implantable. So you can imagine that in the future, this is something that could be used, it could be customized for drugs. They've also done a proof of concept study showing the ability to detect physiological levels of cocaine. But the aptamers can be designed to recognize a broad range of different analytes. And so this has potential usefulness for anything that you want to monitor on a continuous basis. We have those projects I told you about are coming from the investigator community. They're investigator initiated, but we also have a point of care technologies research network called POCTERN, which is a centers network we established about 10 or 11 years ago. It's now in its third funding cycle. And we're doing this in partnership with a number of other institutes. We have centers focused on point of care technologies and sensors for HIV/AIDS, for sexually transmitted diseases, heart, lung, blood, and sleep. And then we have a more general one at Emory and Georgia Tech. And what kind of makes this a network is that they're all focused on developing new technologies, but they're also very outwardly focused to the community. So they supply advice, they do clinical needs assessment, they do clinical testing of new devices, they provide grant funding to investigators across the country, and they have a coordinating center that supplies additional resources like regulatory advice and commercialization advice. This is an example of one of the technologies developed in the Acme Center. It is a smartphone app that should be downloadable soon, if it isn't already. And it's quite remarkable for its ability to detect anemia. It's basically, you have the app on your phone, you take a picture of your fingernails, and within a couple of minutes, it gives you a readout of whether or not you have anemia. And I saw this demonstrated recently. We had a technology showcase for a bunch of congressional staffers, and we showed them different technologies that we're developing so that they like us. And this was one of the demos, and I got my fingernails done, no anemia. And then somebody else had her fingernails photographed, and the guy who was doing it started saying, "Oh, well," and she said, "Don't worry, I know I have anemia." So it was a very dramatic demo, actually. This is this is a very cool resource. It's an example of the kinds of things that the network is producing for the health of the community, the vitality, I should say, of the research community. They have developed this gate system, and there's a publicly available version of it. There it is. Publicly available version of it at gates.org. It's sort of a generic milestone system. If you're developing a new device, here are all the milestones you have to hit. Here are all the activities you have to engage in. Here's what you should do first. Here's what you should do second. In 4 different domains: the clinical domain, the commercialization domain, the regulatory domain, and the technical and science domain. And as you fill in these different, it kind of reminds me of that Apple Watch thing that tells you if you've walked enough steps yet, but it's similarly, as you fill this in, you get a snapshot of the maturity of your project and what steps you may have neglected on the way to get where you are. Engineers are very big about thinking about everything up front. So this provides a nice checklist. Don't develop a thing and then ask, does anyone want this thing in the clinic? And find out, no, nobody wants it. So it's I think, going to be a broadly useful tool, and it kind of acts as guidance for our POC-turn community. So with all of this data generation, we're of course interested in data analysis and modeling, and we have a large program in multiscale modeling that we run in coordination across NIH with other institutes and with other agencies of the government as well. We had a workshop recently where we talked about how machine learning and multiscale modeling might complement and synergize with each other. Very different approaches, different constraints, different potential pitfalls, and which in this workshop they explored ways that the two might balance each other and address some of the pitfalls of either side. This was published recently in a Nature journal, and it's really an interesting, one of the things that's interesting about it is sort of the, it makes you appreciate the infancy of where we are with the math right now. And a lot of the discussion I've heard this morning raising what seem like really intractable problems, I think some of those issues are going to disappear as we develop our analytical methods and our modeling methods and our machine intelligence methods, and as we develop an appreciation of what the data can and cannot tell us. But we're at a very early stage now, and the good news is that we're at an early stage in the midst of a growing field. So from the perspective of the Engineering Institute, we feel like we're kind of at the start of what is becoming a real revolution in healthcare. To try to capture as many potential opportunities as we can, we've embarked on a strategic planning effort, and this one is unique in my experience, and it's actually kind of fun. We've set up 7 different subgroups and invited researchers from the extramural community to think about the 7 different areas and advise us on what is the state of each field now, what are the opportunities, and what are some really bold predictions that one can make about the promise that the future holds in these areas. We've had a number of face-to-face meetings. We just had one in January, and the plan is starting to take shape. I invite all of you to weigh in on the draft plan, which is going to be released publicly probably sometime around the summer. And if you sign up for our listserv at nibib.nih.gov, you will certainly be notified when the strategic plan is open for comment. So we see, because of the growing influence of engineering on biomedical research, we're seeing a lot of emergent opportunities, and coming especially from our institute in the areas I talked about with new sensors and new imaging modalities, new engineered biology. We can look forward to a time when we all can have a duplicate of ourselves on a chip, so that in that experimental way we can ask which drugs are going to be effective against my tumor. we'll have lots of sensor information about ourselves. We'll know exactly what we look like on the inside. And how do we integrate all this information and make good use of it? The other trend driven by computational modeling and the whole explosion of digital research are things like digital twins, where all this information about a person can be integrated into one digital twin, another sort of engineering concept, not of a car, but of a person, so that we can model what different interventions will do for a particular condition that the person may have. Virtual clinical trials are another really exciting concept where we can potentially model what different interventions will do in different situations. And I want to call your attention to one that was published by Carl Meyer's group at the FDA in doing a clinical trial on digital breast tomosynthesis versus digital mammogram. And it's a really nice study because there was already a large real clinical trial done with about 400 patients looking at the two approaches. And so the question they're asking is not only how do these two interventions compare, but how does the results of this virtual trial compare with the real world trial? And they found that the digital breast tomosynthesis was superior to the same extent that was found in the original clinical trial. There were, I'm forgetting now, I think it was about 1,000 sort of digital virtual patients that were computer generated in their trial. But the trial took about a third of the time, it cost far less money, and it didn't involve giving 400 women multiple doses of X-ray exposure. And so it really gives you the feeling like we're starting to be in the future now. Many of you may be aware of both of these enterprises, which also are kind of futuristic in their goals. One is the UK Biobank, and one of us is the NIH All of Us project. In both of these, they're gathering a lot of data on a lot of people, and from a lot of different directions: genomics, health records, images, and what they're doing is developing a really broad, diverse, representative data set that is going to form the basis of future analysis that will hopefully help us learn things about what data can tell us. So to summarize, engineering is growing, and we're now about actually 13% of the NIH budget. The NIBIB funding is not so much growing, but it is highly leveraged. It is in very high demand, and it has a very high return on investment. We're seeing a lot of opportunities now with explosions in both technology and in biomedical knowledge, and bringing those two together is going to synergistically create an explosion, I think, of new information that is going to transform healthcare in the not too distant future. Importantly, machine intelligence is playing a role and is going to be needed for us to get the most out of the complex dynamic data that we're generating. And as we look to the future, we're thinking that the whole healthcare system is going to move away from this episodic snapshot to a continuous monitoring approach that we hope will not only help prevent disease, but be less costly, particularly with the tendency of technologies to always move toward reduced cost, but just preventing disease itself and preventing hospitalizations. is expected to reduce costs. Importantly, with continuous monitoring, we hope that we'll all be able to be maintained in a more optimized state, and we'll all have longer health spans, if not lifespans. The other thing that's very important to our institute and is a big driver for our point-of-care program is to increase the access of healthcare to everybody in remote and rural settings and globally. And I think technology there again is one way that we can hope to exploit to democratize access to high-quality healthcare for everybody. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes to ask questions of Dr. Heemskerk. If anybody has any questions, that would be great. I'll start off, I guess, with the POCTRAN, with a question about POCTRAN. You have some clear sites and coordination now. Is there expectation that that will grow? I mean, I can kind of the places where those are pretty high intensity centers now, is, you know, but we heard about places in the country where maybe some of that could be more
I really do think it is growing. So it has been growing. It started out as an NIBIB funded effort, and in this last round we pulled in 3 or 4 new institutes who are similarly interested and now really appreciate the potential value of point-of-care technologies, and other institutes have expressed an interest. So I do think in the future that it will get bigger and bigger.
So I have a question, because I'm always curious how other groups prioritize resources. So we certainly have limited resources like you do and everybody else. So when you're trying to figure out how to spend your dollars, whether it be in funding of grants, et cetera, what metrics do you look at? Do you look at public health impact, number of people affected, areas of need? Like, what are some of the considerations?
So all of those things. As a small institute, we think it's really important to support our community as broadly as possible, and so we have developed grant programs with an eye to kind of spreading the wealth. We have small exploratory grants that are specifically for new investigators so that we can support the new engineers coming into the field. We have done a very thorough job of examining our portfolio. When NIBIB started, we were formed by pulling existing grants from other institutes. And so the portfolio had an engineering flavor, but it was less engineering rich than it now is. And that's because we're looking at it and saying, well, this grant looks like it should be funded at the Mental Health Institute. So we are very driven to supporting the engineering and imaging technology development communities.
Okay, that's fascinating. Actually, really, really interesting stuff. We probably could listen to the possibilities and the things that you guys are working on all day and be like a NOVA seminar. So, and I will make sure that we provide the listserv to everyone who's here, because I think now we all want to immediately do that when we leave. And I think, you know, that will keep us much more in close contact, but it was really great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay. Yes.